Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Chunksterama. This is a little BookTube event that David Murphy and I are doing where, in the midst of quarantine, when you are perhaps presented with more free time, we encourage you to use some of that free time to pull down the enormous books off your shelf that you've always said you would get to if you had a long stretch of uninterrupted time. Well, a lot of us do, unfortunately, have an enforced stretch of uninterrupted time. That is lessening for a lot of places. Here in America, for instance, most of the original hotspots for the pandemic have cooled off quite a bit. Here in Massachusetts, our peak, due to effective social distancing measuring, and also perhaps due to intense seasonality of this virus, our peak has dropped off drastically. Drastically. Our hospital services are opening back up to all kinds of things. They're not dedicated anymore to pandemic response. Our society, the normal shops on the street, are opening back up. That's the sort of thing that is now the reverse is happening in large parts of the country that were blithely ignoring this thing, that had no cases, that had no social distancing, that had no quarantine of any kind, no containment measures. Those areas are now starting to see massive spikes. And we shall see if seasonality, if this virus is intensely seasonal, we'll see if that helps them out. It isn't so far. But in the meantime, while quarantine is still in effect for a lot of us, David and I thought we would encourage you to pull big books off your shelf and read them. And the first book that we encouraged you to do was Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Big chunkster of a thing, 1,200 pages in some editions, but very inviting. And maybe something that's been on your list for a long time. It was David's first time reading Lord of the Rings, and it wasn't my first time reading it. And our second choice, the second chunkster that we're doing, the one for June, is Adam Smith's 1776 classic, The Wealth of Nations, which is widely regarded, at least in layman's circles, but I imagine in specialist circles as well, as a kind of foundation stone for the modern concept of economics, economic study. Everybody that has written in economics since Adam Smith has had one eye cocked over their shoulder in his direction, which, for good or ill, makes him one of the most influential writers in the subject. And as you can see, The Wealth of Nations is big. it's 800 pages thereabouts, and we are going part by part. So we're now going to be dealing with we're going to do part one and for a couple of weeks, and then part 2 and 3 will be 1 week, and then part 4 will be the parts in the book, as you know, if you've poured through it, are not of equal length, or as you maybe got the impression from David's first video, not of equal importance either, of equal interest. And we are still working our way through the early part of this book, and boy, oh boy, has the pace picked up. It has indeed, as Smith makes clear, because the whole theory, the groundbreaking theory of his book, is that the typical conception of the Cromwellian Revolution against the crown, the English Civil War that led to the arrest, trial, and execution of an anointed king, Charles I, that the typical conception of that as having sprung from sort of the ground up, a conception that Cromwell himself loved to spread around, that this was a popular revolt against the king, popular in the sense of being channeled mostly through the House of Commons. The theory that the interpretation that Smith puts forward is that isn't true. That this was largely, as you can tell from this particular edition, has the Noble Revolt as a title. Maybe it's an American edition, but the thrust of Smith's theory is that it was a cadre of lords in the House of Lords that led this thing, that wrested the control of England from the hands of the king as an absolute monarch into the hands of not the people, but a tiny handful of people. And if that starts to make the whole thing look a little dirtier, a little more suspect, a little more human, well, then the concomitant effect of that is going to be to make Cromwell look worse. It's going to start to look more like one person was leading key players, moving key levers in order to gain the power of the king rather than to disperse the power of the king, as he so often said. And if you have a very long chunkster of a book that is going to let's not vilify that. That's a little bit beyond what Smith is trying to do. But if you have a book that is de-heroizing Cromwell, then it almost stands to reason that King Charles is going to start to look a little better. And sure enough, in this part that we're reading this week, we see over and over again Charles trying hard to accommodate the very men who are trying to depose him. Trying hard in his own way. He was, as I mentioned, an anointed king. He was the son of an anointed king, the grandson of anointed rulers. He believed, and so did all of his subjects, that he was chosen by God. That the king derived his power from God. And that therefore it was, as Charles said at his trial, not the place of other men to judge him. In which case you could have a good king or you could have a bad king, and you could admonish him, or you could tighten his purse strings, or you could yell at him in the street. But you couldn't depose him and cut his head off. And maybe you shouldn't have. That maybe you shouldn't have wanted to. That maybe Charles I was, horror of horrors and almost unheard of in interpretations of this period, not all that bad. Maybe he wasn't all that bad. And we see that in this section over and over again. It's particularly, Smith is such a dramatic writer, such a wonderful way with a narrative that you don't feel the length of this book at all, not in the slightest. And this particular part that we're dealing with this week deals with a standout episode of that, the Earl of Strafford. A wrathful, vengeful, red-faced, hard-handed murderer who very much wanted a radical change in Charles's power over him, in Charles's power over the House of Lords, over Parliament. Maybe even to the point of violence. And yet, when those attainders were brought in front of him, when Strafford was condemned to Charles, he went out of his way, bent over backwards, to go around that, to soften it, to lessen it. Come now, is what he always used to say. Come now. We don't need to do all that, right? The one thing he wasn't willing to do is the one thing Cromwell and his cronies, a tiny handful of cronies, demanded of him, was that he stop being king, or that king start being something different. That's the one thing Charles wasn't willing to do. He was willing to do everything else. And we have a little segment here where, this is very, sorry. Discussion of economics always makes me sneeze. This is very embedded text. It's hard to price out a part that will make sense as a read, but I want to give you just a bit to illustrate that point. What seems clear is that by this point, Charles was adamant that his conscience would not allow him to sign an attainder bill that condemned Strafford to death for treason of which he believed he was innocent, and that to avoid being required by Parliament to do so, he was prepared to make extensive concessions to Bedford. That's who Strafford is. He was ready to reward friends and buy off expected opposition. This is partly conjecture, but perhaps the only way of explaining the cornucopia of preferments that poured in the juntos, that is, the tiny handful's direction, in the 3 days between that Sunday, the 25th, and the final hearing in Westminster Hall on the following Thursday, the 29th. Perhaps the most astonishing of these concessions, and one which must have required all of Bedford's courtly powers of persuasion, was the belated appointment, also on Sunday the 25th of April, of the Earl of Warwick to the petitioner-grandee so conspicuously passed over in the conciliar appointments back in February to the membership on the Privy Council. For Charles, this must have been particularly irksome, as Warwick was prominent among those arguing strongly for Strafford's execution. And I know that quote isn't going to make a whole lot of sense outside of context, but the point to underscore there is that Charles was willing to do a whole bunch of things that weren't palatable to him in order to appease the tiny knot of his noble opposition. And the whole point of this section of the book that is underscoring over and over again is that tiny knot of noble opposition was the revolt. It was the heart and soul of the English Civil War. It was not from the ground up. It was not even from the House of Commons up. It wasn't. This is the central point that Adam Smith is making, and I think it's a really good one. And it's done in a really, as we mentioned about The Wealth of Nations, it's done in a really readable style from start to finish. It reads almost like a page-turner. It's so mellifluously written, as you could tell, right, even in that little excerpt. And we'll have more excerpts as our read-along goes on, because we're going to continue, of course. Chunksterama rolls right on. June is devoted to The Wealth of Nations, So next Sunday, we will reconvene and talk a little more about this fascinating bedrock of economic history. Thank you, Book 2.